Hi, Ian. It's really good to be back with you.
Hello, Alex. Very good to see you again. Yes,
So today we're discussing finally chapter 18, entitled The Untimely Demise of Intuition. So we're back to this important theme of intuition from many facets, right?
that's right. And it's probably worth my pointing out at this stage that I cover a number of different ways in which we use the idea of intuition. It covers a number of related but probably rather different things. For example, in chapter 17, I started by looking at instincts and then moved on to gut reactions by people who are anything from a racehorse tipster to a motorbike rider to a world-renowned art expert. And then I looked at the acquired skills of people like chess players and surgeons and pilots, and at the place of pattern recognition, which is often well, it begins as an unconscious awareness of similarities. But there are other things too, which are included probably under the heading of intuition, and they understandably give rise to concern in some people about whether they should trust their intuition. And one of these is prejudice and stereotypes, the rules of thumb that are called technically heuristics, but that's basically what they are, and the general ability to find your way between reason and appropriate emotion so as to take into account a whole range of considerations and values.
Mhm.
So those are the things that we'll be talking about a bit today.
Very interesting. That already clarifies for me, after having read the chapter, this constellation of, yeah, of well, some you will put under the umbrella of intuition, others won't be there. But nevertheless, so how to navigate the difference between prejudice and bias and stereotype and heuristics. But before we go into it, I think it's very important to mention a suggestion, a claim or suggestion you have at the beginning of the chapter, which is that um, at the heart of the mistrust in intuition, because we're going to be covering how bad press intuition gets, there's a mistrust of the human being, and I
Yes.
think this is profoundly important. And in a way, this chapter is as I read it, is a kind of manifesto, and trying to say, please let's stop doing this to ourselves. And why are we doing this to ourselves?
Yes, that's a very important and central point. Um, I will be amazingly giving the keynote speech to a World Conference of AI experts in Amsterdam in the middle of October. And I've been thinking a lot about what to say, and a good place to start is the idea which began to be popular among psychologists in the 1960s and 70s that really we were somewhat imperfect machines. Well, hardly
Mm,
surprisingly, because we don't aspire to be machines.
yeah.
And we do many things that machines can't do. And I suppose ultimately what I'm talking about is all the things that don't come into a rational calculus, which is just about everything that we care about in life, all our
Mm,
great concerns and loves and things that we value for their beauty, for their goodness, for their truth, for their. These are not necessarily where reason is able to take them in. And, we are embodied beings, and this is not a mistake. It wouldn't be better if we were disembodied. In fact, it's when we try to be disembodied that we become very poor human beings and give rise to the thought that, well, maybe if human beings are that poor, then
mm,
we really might be better off with the machine because it can do those things better,
yeah,
faster. I mean,
yeah,
we program them so that they will do.
yeah.
So that's the thing there. We mustn't be afraid of our gut feelings, of our intuitions, of our emotional understanding, because, as I will suggest, it's far far richer than any rational calculus. And as you know, I'm not here making a manifesto for being irrational. I prefer to use the word supra-rational or trans-rational for those things that simply get left out of a rational calculus but are terribly important.
Indeed,
Towards the end of this chapter, I talk about an arts council project in which they try to operationalize and score the worthwhileness of a work of art in an attempt to know where to spend their money.
yes.
And not surprisingly, the artists are not very impressed by this, as indeed I'm not.
Yes, yes. I mean, this is a very high level topic. We can dwell on it a bit more and then go to the specific points made in the chapter. But let me just say another thing. There seems to be a very weird relationship between us and the machines in terms of them being this kind of dark mirror we've set for ourselves. And I wonder, this mistrust in intuition, which is a mistrust in ourselves, to me seems to have something to do with uh, not wanting to be fallible, with fallibility, and it reveals some sort of, in a way, cute human vulnerability. It's like we're trying to hide from something that makes us feel very vulnerable, and we've tried in a way to compensate for that through machines. Obviously, it's not working, and I wonder if you could say something more about it. What is at the heart of this, push or escape for anything that has to do with, I was going to say error, but it's not even being wrong. With this attempt to kind of clean the human from all these impurities that people
Yes.
seem we have, and just leave, some sort of pristine reason kind of there, and all the rest should be gone. It's like an original sin. I mean, I don't want to get too theological there, but there seems to be an original thing exercised through our relationship with machines at the core of it.
Yes, that's right. And I'm glad you said it's not about being wrong, because this attempt often leads us to be very badly misguided. I actually begin the chapter with a complicated dilemma problem called the Monty Hall dilemma, which we don't need to go into in detail. But the take-home message is that if you're going to reason, even about something that is simply a matter of reason, you have to be very sure that you've got your reasoning right, because on this particular problem, even world-class mathematicians found that they couldn't accept the reasoning. So reasoning, even in the most simple, simply mathematical areas, can lead us to mistakes. But once it gets outside of the purely mathematical, it's definitely going to mislead us. And there are many examples of people with brain injuries or mental illness who, far from losing their faculty of reason, have lost everything but their faculty of reason, and as a result become very, very disturbed and unhappy, and complain that the simplest things that they see other people able to do, they can't do. And what they've lost is an intuitive faculty, which is quite close to common sense. And one of the great things that we've lost is, in the era we're in now, is, what on earth happened to common sense? It seems to be, again, another of these things we eschew, because there are situations, of course, in which common sense can be shown to be fallible, but there are also many in which it can be shown to protect us from harm. The other thing to say about that need to somehow secure oneself and be certain and certainly right is that this is the goal of the left hemisphere, to be always in control, always to be able to manipulate things and to know how things work. And it can do that up to a point, but when it tries to make this stand in for a proper human imagination, human sensibility, human intelligence, it is a terrible shame, because we lose whatever it is that makes us so able to live as fulfilled human beings.
Yes, and there is an irony which you point soon in the chapter, which is that, well, you were talking about common sense, but funny enough, many psychologists and neuroscientists and cognitive scientists love to point to all these illusions and how
Yes.
fooled we are, But the moment they walk
Yes.
out the door of the lab and carry on with their normal lives, well, they're using all that toolkit that supposedly is so illusory and flawed to just navigate their daily lives, right? So what a tension and what an
Indeed.
irony in wanting to point out how flawed we are, but then using those very same resources to simply leave.
Well, because they have to. I mean, if they tried to do what in theory they aim to be showing in the lab, in life, they would become like, I've referred to him before, Antonio Damasio's patient Elliot, who can stand in for, as a good example, of somebody whose brain had ceased to be able to do anything other than rationalize as a machine would.
So if you may, let's go into the distinction between prejudice and bias and stereotypes one at a time, because I also need to go back to it after having read it to be clear about what they are and how they relate to each other in a kind of constellation. So where would you like to start?
Well, let's just start by talking about prejudice. Um, and and we can talk about stereotypes there, and then we can come to bias. The distinction is not always clear cut, but I think certainly what I am aiming to distinguish here is the inevitability of having a prejudice, but the absolute non-inevitability of acting on a stereotype in a given human situation. And to do that is bias. So, to begin with prejudices, well, a prejudice simply means a prejudgment. And as the philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer pointed out, there is no possibility of not having a prejudice, because a prejudice is simply one's judgment on experience so far. I mean, that is a kind of prejudice, at any rate, that nobody can avoid having. We would be very stupid if we didn't draw conclusions from experience. We wouldn't last. We couldn't possibly survive. And we also couldn't possibly survive unless our prejudices were reasonably good. I mean, only reasonably so, but we're talking about the area of reason. And Gadamer talked about the prejudice against prejudice, because it is a prejudice, and nobody can escape from a certain world picture. The very world picture that we need to escape from prejudice comes exactly, intuitively, in a prejudice out of the Enlightenment. It was a prejudice of the Enlightenment, and it's not a completely worthless prejudice. We should always be questioning our prejudices, but to suggest that we can't have prejudices is wrong. And when we try to force people not to have a prejudice, we simply force them to have a different prejudice. So the existence of prejudice is in itself not necessarily good or bad. There can be, of course, viral prejudices that are not based on experience, but based merely on a received idea. But that doesn't mean that all our prejudices are wrong. For example, if we know that conviction rates for violent crime are far higher amongst males than females, and we're walking down a street at night and we see a group of young men walking towards us in a threatening way, we're right to feel more frightened than if we saw a group of ballerinas walking down the street. That's not a prejudice. That's being careful and sensible. So that's where it starts. And the interesting thing about prejudices is that they can be validated. So stereotypes, which are often the equivalent of prejudices, can be evaluated. And they can be evaluated against more objective criteria. And I'm not saying that, and here actually I'm not doing anything other than reporting what the scientific literature shows. And experts in the field say the only way to make a case that prejudice is almost always wrong, or even commonly wrong, is to cherry pick from the data, because there's a vast body of data. And what it shows is that prejudices are both the same generally around the world, so the same stereotypes about differences between men and women, the same stereotypes about different cultures, the same stereotypes about the young and the old, are held very broadly in almost all cultures in the world. And when validated against objective criteria, they are between 0.7 and 0.9 on a scale in which the average score for a finding in the social sciences is 0.21. So they are enormously high, as Lee Jussim, who is one of the people who's studied this most and has written at length about it, the rightness, the appropriateness of stereotypes is one of the most validated findings in the whole of social psychology. So that gives one pause to think. But the important thing is that, first of all, people always think that other people use stereotypes and other people are prejudiced, but they don't think that they are prejudiced. In a study of 661 people, only one person thought that he was more prejudiced than average. And the greatest prejudice is that people in the opposite group are prejudiced and have more stereotypes than you do. And this is the same on the left as it is on the right. So people with whatever political views inevitably think that the other people have more simplistic ideas, are more stereotyped in their ideas, and have, as it were, greater yielding to prejudice. And also, intelligence has nothing to do with it. Intelligent people are sometimes actually found to be more likely to stick to their finding than others in the face of evidence that might disconfirm it. And scientists are by no means protected against this, so that there is a consistent prejudice about other people's prejudice, and it's not something that we can get away from through education or by being more intelligent. It's pervasive. But I think it's extremely important at this point to contrast this with what I'd like to call bias. And bias is biasing your judgments because of a prejudice. And what the literature shows is that if you have nothing else to go on other than the information that a person is of a certain social group, then of course the prejudice is the main thing you have to go on. But as soon as there is more individuating information about this particular case, the effect of following that information rather than the prejudice is enormously strong. So that it's something like the effect of the bias, once there is that information to go on, is one of the smallest in social sciences. So the effect of stereotypes, I think I'm quoting here because I think it's worth doing this, is one of the smallest in social psychology, and the effect of individuating information is one of the largest. So the effect of stereotypes in influencing an individual decision is about 0.1 compared with the average of 0.21, but the effect of individuating information is one of the largest at 0.7 compared with 0.21.
So again, I reckon you as a healer of concepts. I told you this on a few occasions. So here you're doing that again on a topic that's not the most politically correct. Now let me go 2 or 3 steps back. and reflect on the fact that we've been discussing often that we are embodied beings. Again, the obvious is sometimes not trivial. We are embodied beings and we are historical beings. So back to prejudice, for those who are still not comfortable with the idea that we all have them, it's inevitable and it's even good that we have them. I would want to ask two questions, generally speaking. One is, how could we even imagine not having a prejudice? What would that even look like in terms of, engaging with the world? Probably it's impossible to even conceive. And the second one is, what does it take to erase or change a prejudice or a stereotype? Because once we've discovered we have them and they're useful, some people would still say, sure, but sometimes we need to apply force to change them, and that seems to lead to a lot of violence in a general sense. So this these two thoughts, right? What would it take to not have a prejudice? It's, to me, inconceivable. But then how does one change them in a healthy manner, not applying strong violence to other people?
Yes, very good points. And as I said, I think we should always be examining our prejudices and testing them against experience. And if we find that consistently the prejudice is found, in a sample of people from a certain background, then we should change that prejudice. And so I think prejudice should always be something that evolves. And I'm afraid the problem comes when people don't allow themselves close enough to examine individual cases. But what would it take not to would be to have to examine every single situation involving a human being, as it were, from ground zero. And that's something that we can't do. And we wouldn't actually be able to do this if we wanted, because, as I say, we have to make choices in life. And to make those choices, we use prior information. And prior information is prejudgment. And prejudgment is prejudice. So without them, we cannot work, we cannot function in the world. We can function in a mathematical construct, we can function in a science lab, but we can't function in any human setting without allowing our history, our experience, and so on to influence our decisions. And, because people may say, well, that sounds fine in theory and in abstract, but it just doesn't happen. I quote there a piece of research that was, two pieces of research actually, done by a female professor of jurisprudence at University of London, Cheryl Thomas, who was commissioned by the Crown to investigate the behaviours of juries. For example, do white juries tend to convict more black people than white people, given similar circumstances? And what she found was that they were actually less likely to convict black people than white people, given the same kind of a situation. And that, in fact, regardless of the composition of the jury, black or white, black defendants were more likely to be acquitted than white defendants. And this was particularly true of juries drawn from areas where there were mixed, where it was a fairly mixed racial group. And she also found that actually another story that we're often told is that juries are very reluctant to convict for rape. And to an extent, of course, they have to be very careful, because inevitably it's not likely to be entirely cut and dried. But the fact is that conviction rates for rape objectively are higher than for some other violent offences. And I give the specifics and the references in the book. All I'm really trying to do here is not say that you don't meet bigoted individuals. We've all met them. I don't want to say that certain prejudices are not harmful. They clearly can be, and they can be vile and dangerous. But the idea that simply having a prejudice the kind of prejudice that 97% of us must have in order to carry on our lives, is wrong. So what we need to do is to find a way through this. And the very good news is that whenever we know more about a particular individual that counteracts the stereotype, we are enormously good at doing that, which I think find very optimistic and a very good finding to counter the constantly bleak story that we're told that, you know, we're hopelessly prejudiced about everything. We all have our prejudices, and you don't spot your own prejudice. It's called my side prejudice, and it's just the same on the right and on the left. You don't spot your own prejudices. You think the other people are the only people to have prejudices. I quote in the book an American formerly German psychologist called Ichheimer, who fled Nazi Germany because he was Jewish. So he knew exactly how vile prejudice could be. But his conclusion is that psychologists quite often have prejudices of their own, such as that, for example, all prejudices are mistaken, that there are no differences between different cultural and social groups, and so forth. So I think on every side and on all occasions, we need to be aware that there can be I'm not saying we shouldn't be alert to prejudices, but also that we need to think more subtly about the nature of prejudice and not altogether dismiss them.
There is a apparently counterintuitive point you make with respect to emotions that's interesting to me, which is that a way, at least as I understand it, a way to navigate prejudices in a more healthy manner would be emotions, precisely because emotions engage you with the data. So one may think, well, it's through thinking that we may be able to, again, clean those edges. But you, again, insist on the power of emotions. And I really like this idea. Emotions really connect you, basically touch the actual data. And that can be a more effective way of updating your beliefs, if you want, rather than thinking about them, discussing them, and then in a rather artificial way pruning, again, the errors.
Yes, I mean, of course, what I'm not saying is that anybody who has an impassioned point of view is going to escape from prejudice. Not at all. I think what you're referring to is a piece of research that shows that when people are not highly invested in a particular topic, that they are relatively impervious to arguments that might persuade them. But when they actually care a great deal about a topic, interestingly, they're more open to arguments that would make them change their mind because they really care about the truth here. Instead of just tub thumping and saying, well, I identify with this social group and we're always on the right side, they actually do want to know the reality.
Yeah.
And under those circumstances, it is very interesting. They are more likely to listen to counter arguments. So it's a difficult area, but as you say, just trying to absent yourself from the discussion, deal with it in an inhuman way, doesn't have a good track record for helping people change their minds. Yeah. We can't disengage our whole embodied emotional experience of life, but we need to be careful about it. It reminds me slightly of something that I say in talking about science in a chapter that we've already discussed. I think it would be chapter 11 on the proper claims of science to the truth. And in it I take issue with the idea that we should be very careful about what models we use in investigating science. And the sort of suggestion is, and in fact it's stated by this particular author, who incidentally I think very highly of, Philip Ball. He says, you know, metaphors and models should be allowed into science only after very careful scrutiny. Well, yes, in a way, but you can't do science without having a metaphor or a model. The idea that you could possibly get anywhere in science without metaphors and models is a mistake. And not realizing that you're using them is the dangerous bit. And I say it's a little bit like saying, the price of having tires on your wheels is eternal vigilance. Well, it is, but you can't get anywhere without tires. You
Yeah.
can't get anywhere without a model. And really the equivalent in social life as well as in social science is that we have models about how people behave. And if they weren't generally rather helpful, we wouldn't have them at all. But we
Yes.
need to be constantly vigilant about them. That is the point. Like having tires on your car, you've got to keep looking at them.
It makes me think of my own critiques of the field of neuroscience in particular. Like there are these three M's: models, metaphors, and metaphysics, that most people hate or don't like or don't feel comfortable with. But rather than saying, well, let's see what they are, they like to pretend they're not there. Like, no, I'm doing science without metaphysics, or I'm doing science really without metaphors, or we don't really need models, we only need data. It's when you look at it for some time, it's in a way it's cute, it's funny, it doesn't make me laugh, but again, it's interesting because it mirrors what we're talking about here today. About there are these aspects we want to pretend they don't belong here. They don't belong to the human enterprise. Be it a scientist, an art critic, or a doctor.
Yes, and of course, to stop at data would be to cut your throat as a scientist, and it would mean you knew nothing.
Mm.
All you would do would be amass enormous amounts of data. But in order to understand data, you have to be selective. You have to see patterns. And this means preferring some ways of looking to others. And all scientists, of course, do it. And as has been pointed out, science is heavily dependent on metaphor, more so than everyday language. This is very well known and is the topic of Metaphors We Live By and Philosophy in the Flesh. Two extraordinarily good books that I recommend to anybody watching this podcast.
Yes.
Equally, the idea that metaphysics should have nothing to do with science is a foolish one. If you want to read a good scientist on this topic, I recommend Erwin Chargaff's autobiography, Heraclitean Fire. Unfortunately, it's quite hard to get hold of now. It's not a long read, but it's an utterly brilliant book. And he was a foremost scientist of the last century who basically laid the ground for Crick and Watson's discovery of the structure of DNA. And equally, I would say philosophers such as Ian Whitehead, he said the divorce between science and metaphysics has been a disaster for both parties.
So let's go back to the casual knocking of intuition, which is not casual, actually. And in this chapter, you make this living vivisection of one of the greatest intellectuals in psychology and economics, you could say, or economical thinking, which is Kahneman, right? As to the two systems of making decisions. And that also has to do with the power or the ability of reason to, let's say, clean system one and then pretend that by handing over system two, well, there'll be no mistakes there, and we can do well and better only with it. So maybe this takes us a few minutes, but I think it's interesting what you, again, dare to do in this chapter, because you quote Kahneman and then you double click, as I say, on the actual statements and the references. And you do that thing that many academics don't do, which is actually read the actual works cited and the works cited therein in a kind of rabbit hole to really figure out, well, what are the claims really and what that really means.
Yes. The first thing I ought to say is that I don't critique Kahneman's work as a whole, and in fact I value his work and find it very interesting. But I think sometimes he falls into a problem about allowing a bias into the way he looks at this. And probably just before I mention any more about that, it's worth saying that idea about systems 1 and 2, I don't think this represents, some people say to me, so is system 1 the more quick and dirty one? Is that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere the more deliberative one? There are a number of things to say about that. The first is that I don't think Kahneman is aiming to distinguish between the hemispheres. And he and I have exchanged emails on this. My take, and he confirms it, is that he's looking at the higher, more evolved cortical functions in relation to lower and more ancient integrative functions. But if anything, it is the left hemisphere that jumps to conclusions and the right hemisphere that says, hang on a minute, there might be something else going on here. The next thing to say about that particular thing, we might want to mention this again later, is that it's not always true that it's quicker to use intuition than it is to use reason. That in some cases, as and I quote again the science here, it is actually reasoning to a conclusion is quite straightforward, but actually it's tending to your intuitions may take a little bit longer. So in both those ways, there isn't a kind of line-up between the hemispheres that suits Kahneman, or would suit not Kahneman himself, who doesn't claim to be interested in hemisphere differences, I think, but wouldn't suit people who want to make those links. And a further point just to make here is that it's the right inferior frontal gyrus that is good at this process of cautioning about a stereotype being applied in this case, and it is the left inferior frontal gyrus that tends to promote the application of a stereotype in this case. I just thought that was an interesting sidelight on the way the hemispheres deal with this before we look at Kahneman's statement. I mean, the thing here is I can say it quite quickly, and I don't want to go drill down, as they say, into the stuff that I do actually quote in, as you say, in detail in the book, just to make sure that people understand. But Kahneman made some rather surprising statements, effectively dismissing experts by saying things like that a radiographer would interpret the same chest X, an expert radiographer is likely to reinterpret differently, re-diagnose a chest X-ray after only a few minutes. That was the one that really made me sit up, because I thought, I don't think I've ever seen this happening, and even in much, much more complicated things than interpreting an X-ray, like interpreting an MRI scan of the brain. I've not seen this process at work. I've seen them as enormously skilled interpreters. So he then goes on to say, and the same thing is true of, I don't know what they are actually, some form of investment advisors or accountants. And then he quotes James Chanteau, who actually happens to be an expert on expertise, though Kahneman doesn't quote that, saying that he's looked into 41 different areas of expertise and confirms that experts are very little better than chance. Well, this astonished me, because I've heard people casually sort of knocking intuition in this way, but this is a very specific way to claim, that experienced doctors are that bad at diagnosing. So I thought I'd look up the papers in every case, and to cut a long story short, they're inaccurate. I mean, inaccurate is a bit of an understatement. So, for example, in the case of the expert radiographers, there was nothing about radiographers or the interpretation of an X-ray film or chests at all, nor were these people necessarily experts. Some of them weren't even qualified, and it may be presumed that most of the others were, for reasons I won't go into, not actually experts. But what they did was a much harder task: to take out of context 6 possible findings on paper from a gastrointestinal investigation and say whether this indicated cancer or not. And of course, these things are very rarely cut and dried, actually, and much harder to point to than pointing to a chest X-ray and saying there is a lesion here that should not be there. And even there, they did show themselves 80% of the time, although they were inexpert and although they were doing a very difficult exercise that doesn't yield itself comfortably to yes and no answers, they managed to be consistent with one another 80% of the time. And then the same thing is broadly true of the other cases, including the financial economist one. And the last one is breathtaking because it doesn't consider 41 cases. It considers, I think, 46 papers, not all of which are referring to experts, but where they do, 5 of them are critical of experts, the other 41 are either supportive or neutral. And Chanteau himself, the man who carried out the research, said, I started off in this area thinking that I would prove expertise to be wrong, but I've actually discovered that experts are generally extraordinarily gifted at making decisions, and I have since, at that stage, over the last 10 to 15 years, moved in his research to finding out quite why experts are so very good at what they do. And he goes further and says that situations are now geared to de-skilling experts and are set up in such a way that experts will find it harder to use their expertise. And that this is in fact a war between machines and experts. And actually the system should be set up not to de-skill the expert and promote the machine, but they should be set up in such a way as to make the experts maximally effective.
Yes.
This is an area that's been written about a lot by people like Hubert Dreyfus and his brother Stuart Dreyfus, and researched amply. But I just take it as one example in which every single case to which Kahneman referred was being misrepresented. But sadly, this can happen in even a great man's writing, and yes. I think he is a great man, very clearly.
Yes, and the point is not, of course, to pick on him, but I think this is very revealing of how even great research can fall prey to what I call the petri dish taken for the whole world or for the real world.
Yes.
And you make this,
yes.
I mean, at least in my mind, it looks like a hierarchical tree where you can study experts or non-experts. If you study experts, you can study them in real world situations or in artificial situations where they won't be able to manifest their expertise. And even when you study them in the real world, you also mention that if they're not actively engaged, probably that competence cannot be manifested. So it points to the how tricky it is to really do scientific studies on it, and how your biases may make you design the experiment so that you will end up concluding what you wanted to conclude in the first place, even if you didn't know that. I'm not saying you're deliberately tweaking the results, but it's the whole setting. Again, the importance of context, right? The whole setting will determine the yes. conclusion.
That's right, and one other study amongst a number that I look at is one in which any information about the people are asked to diagnose from simply a sheet of paper with some data on it. And first of all, of course, nobody in real life does that. They must see and meet the patient, but anything on the sheet that would have given them too much of a contextual clue was excluded. But even then, experts acting outside their field were able to produce a very high level of accuracy, which I think is worthy of being better known in a world in which we are going around saying, oh, we're so fallible and machines do this better. And by the way, machines, of course, have no intelligence, but what they do have is the benefit of hundreds of thousands of already diagnosed situations, diagnosed by experts and then fed into them. And all they do is scan this database very much faster than the human mind can do. But if the human mind were to try to follow a machine, it would become, of course, not as quick as the machine, but it would become much worse at everything, because it can do all the things the machine can't do. And we really mustn't bring about a world in which expertise is diminished, but in fact one in which it is made even better than it already is.
Yes, yes, wonderful. Iain, let's
one of the things I just thought, can I just say, I think it's an important point about expertise, is that one of the ways to discredit experts is to suggest that they ought to be able to predict the future. But in fact, most experts know that what they are doing is not predicting the future. So, for example, an experienced physician can diagnose a condition and can say what the next steps should be, but as to whether or not you will be alive in a year's time or not, they cannot say that with any degree of certainty.
Yeah.
They can only give probabilities. And one of the ways in which experts have come unstuck has been economic experts, because people always ask them to tell us what's going to happen. And instead of saying, well, I'm not sure we know, which is the correct answer, they say, well, our data show, and what they're actually doing is reporting what a computer program has told them is likely to happen. They can only report what computer models tell them, and computer models are no better at predicting the future than the human expert. So I like to quote Niels Bohr here, who says, prediction is a very difficult art, particularly when it concerns the future. A nice little joke. But I mean, I think we ought to be very well aware of that. What they're good at is seeing, even a chess expert doesn't think 1,000 steps ahead. He or she probably thinks about 6 steps ahead, maximum.
Yes.
And is always doing that on the path. So there we go.
Well, and this is a good segue, actually, because rather than being treated as oracles, experts, as you are, you're able to tell what's next, what to do next. And that seems to fit with heuristics, which is another case of mistrust in intuition, right? And of course, heuristics are not infallible, but they are often accurate and far from useless. And these rules of thumb really allow us to literally navigate the world and decide what to do next.
Exactly, and once again, we wouldn't get very far without heuristics. One of the things that IT has learned is that it has to teach machines heuristics, actually, which are, I mean, it's just a technical term for what we learn in school, at least in the English-speaking world, as rules of thumb. I don't know if there's an equivalent expression in Spanish, but...
not that I recall, but... well, reglas, we call them, well, rules.
Reglas, yes.
Well, I need to think about how we say, so, yes.
Yes, but they're approximate ways of achieving a goal, and we use them all the time, that generally speaking, this will be a useful way of thinking. And of course, that can be applied much more quickly than working through every possibility at the time. One story I rather like is the heuristic used by ants in order to scout out a territory for their colony. So there are ants in some colonies that are specifically tasked to go and look for a new colony. And these scout ants go out, and of course they don't have tape measures, slide rules, computers. So what they do is they crisscross the area, leaving little deposits of pheromone every so often, and then they leave the situation, and they come back a few hours later. And this time, they see how many times they cross a trace of the scent of the pheromone that they laid down. Now, obviously, the bigger the area, the less often they're going to randomly meet one of the pheromone trails that they laid down before. People, rather than ants, in life also find heuristics often extremely helpful.
I like the idea of simple... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on, go ahead.
I was going to say, I like the idea of simple solutions to complex problems. It's not always possible, but later on in the chapter, you go back to this, what I call this dark mirror between machines and humans, and you make this also historical point that in trying to make computers smarter, kind of the rules of the game changed, and people became enamored with statistics and computation and models and complex solutions and optimization. And at the same time, it seemed to be convenient to make humans look dumb or seem dumb, based on the way in which we were programming the computers. But the animal kingdom, and I really like you bring the example of ants. I've studied animals for a long time, animal behavior, and they're able to, solve problems that we would fill whiteboards with and computer code with very simple tricks, and it's amazing, and that speaks to their both their instinct and also their intelligence. I would say that they can do that.
Yes, you're right to say, and I do explain why I say that at one point in this chapter, that complex problems don't require complex solutions. And sometimes what looks like a more subtle and more complex response may be less helpful. For example, going back to a place very close to the start of the chapter, considering the Monty Hall dilemma. This is a parrot. I mean, this is the interesting thing about it. I'm not going to explain the whole thing, but it's there in the book. It's based on an American TV program in which people were asked to guess certain things. But really enormously intelligent, prize-winning mathematicians weren't able to see why the answer was right. Pigeons, after a certain number, I think a couple of hundreds of tests, did get it right. But what they also noticed was that although what one finds is that the majority of times it is better to make a certain decision, the pigeons, knowing that, made that decision every single time. And that sounds less intelligent than if it's like 4 times out of 5 or 3 times out of 4, it will be right. In fact, in this case, it's 2 times out of 3, it will be right. And instead of making the right decision 2 times out of 3, which is what the left hemisphere does in split-brain patients when they're asked to follow a rule, they see, twice out of 3 times it's the green light, so I should 2 out of 3 times go for the green light and only once the red light. But actually this reduces your chances of winning to 0, because of course you don't know what the next one will be, and the chances every single time are the same. 2 times out of 3 it's going to be the red light, not the green light, or whatever it is. And so the way to win is always to press the one that for the majority of times wins you the prize. So that's just a long way round of saying that sometimes when we try to be clever about our responses, we would be better to be mindful of some fairly straightforward principles. The case I particularly love is that of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Harry Markowitz, who created an enormously complex formula for predicting the best way to get a return on investment. But when it came to his own, as you were saying, outside the lab, people behave differently. When it came to his own life, he resorted to a principle developed by, I think, a 3rd or 4th century rabbi, whatever he was, who had the aha moment that actually the way to do well in investments, and it probably can't be bettered, is to put 1/3 of your money in the marketplace, 1/3 in goods, and 1/3 in property, and that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, and by the way, let me mention that sometimes my comments tend to be rather abstract, but I really, really appreciate throughout the book all these very concrete instances that often make me smile. Like you're mentioning the ants and these 2 out of 3 and the pigeons a moment ago, but there's this other one in which you bought a ticket for a concert, and then that very same day you're feeling really, really down and you don't feel like going anywhere. You'd rather prefer stay at home. But you say, well, because I bought it, I'd rather go but you say, well, it actually a better decision would be just to stay at home because you've already paid for it. And so, well, at least that made me smile as to how
yes.
how simple this little tricks that we play on ourselves.
Yes, yes.
And pervasive too. Yeah.
Yes, you've paid for the ticket anyway, so you can either be £60 the poorer and stay at home being comfortable and dry and watching it on television, or you can be £60 the poorer and go out on the streets and take 3 changes of transport and be wet and miserable. Yes.
Yes.
So yeah, we, under those circumstances, a rule of thumb perhaps leads us astray.
Yes. Now, let me mention 2 more examples, which I also enjoyed. So you speak about, well, there's this repeated word kind of experiment,
oh, yes,
or whatever,
yes.
the D word, and also
yes.
the climbing with the weight on the backs of people, and how if people do so, they estimate slopes and things differently. And you make such a great point, which is, well, some experts or some scientists or thinkers may critique and how right these people were, but you really turned the question upside down, and you ask, well, who is really making the mistake here? Because
yes.
because although that may seem from a very decontextualized point of view a stupid thing to do, that's actually the best thing, or not the best, but that's a really good thing you could do in both cases, to skip the word if it's repeated,
yes.
or to have a different estimate of the slope if you're carrying weight.
Yes, yes. The one about the repeated word. I'm quoting John Kay, who says, the economist philosopher, who says, who is better, the one that pedantically points out there is a repeated word, or the one who has a life and understands the meaning of the sentence? Which one's really the loser here? And of course, I know this from experience, because one's eye will not detect in one's own text a repeated word. So kind readers have occasionally written to me, and in a couple of places in the book I have, without seeing it, repeated a word, because my mind knows what I'm really saying and cuts to the chase rather than stumbling over it in the way that a computer would. And the one about the weights is worth pointing out that it's not while climbing, but they're while standing. So the people who are appraising the slope of a hill, they're asked to appraise how steep the hill is, and some of them are just standing looking at it, and others have a heavy weight on their back. Yes. The ones that have the heavy weight on their back say that the slope is steeper, on average, slightly steeper. And yes, the point is, well, how fallible we are. But I point out that actually in life, we are embodied beings in a context. And when we look at that hill, part of our mind is going, well, it's going to be very tough getting this load up that hill. And it wouldn't be better if it didn't do that. I mean, so many times what we're doing is trading off the few cases, the unusual ones, often thought up by psychologists in a lab, to show that a general principle is wrong, against the fact that generally it will be right and will save us. The fact of, okay, it may not be 100% accurate every time, but 98 times out of 100, it's going to be the right thing to do, and we can do it quickly. This is a better way to live than go, no, I've got to put it all through some machine which will tell me what the answer is. We couldn't have survived if we'd done that. And I also just want to make a point which is so obvious, but it still needs to be said, about something we were discussing earlier, which is the validity of stereotypes. People think that they have disproved the validity of a stereotype by pointing to an individual that doesn't fit the stereotype. But the stereotype is just that. It's a stereotype. It doesn't say every single person is like that. That is why when we have data that show that somebody isn't like the stereotype, we are apparently very good at changing our view. So when it comes to showing that a stereotype is wrong, it's not good enough simply to point to something that doesn't prove it or disproves it in that case. All the time, what we are trying to do is get back to our contextual embodied lives, because that's what we need to deal with. And we wouldn't be better without our contextual embodied lives. We wouldn't have a life. We wouldn't have any of the things we love about life. And so this whole exercise of disparaging the body, disparaging nature, disparaging our intuitions is, I think, one of the most destructive things about the culture that we live in now.
And there's still many valuable points in this chapter. Let's see if we can cover them. Related with what you just said, you go back to common sense at the end of this chapter, and I really like that you talk to it as a skill, as playing tennis or learning to draw, right? This idea is powerful because it's also very, very embodied. It's something to practice. And also you dwell into the word common sense, and you say, well, it's not about being usual, it's about being shared. And again, this is enlightening to consider what is meant.
Yes, thank you. Common sense is another one that's been given a good kicking lately. It is a pity, because it is that shared understanding of things that grounds our ability to make good judgments. And here I remember a point made about being in touch with your native language, that people who are still speaking their native language feel more in touch with their rituals, their customs, their habits, the ways of life that are embodied in the traditions and the culture from which they come, and that when they are speaking a second language, their thinking becomes more abstract and disembodied. So, and incidentally, the shocking finding that First Nation peoples in Canada, who, in other words, indigenous people who have been forced to speak English or French, have 6 times higher suicide rates than those that are allowed to carry on speaking their own language. So here is something else that's very important in a world in which a very debased form of English, and it really is a terrible, I can tell you as somebody who likes to enjoy my native language, the kind of language that has become a lingua franca around the world is a terrible version of English. And that has become the way in which we often now converse. So coming back to common sense, one of the problems here is that it is something that we don't really notice how important it is, because it wouldn't function if we constantly noticed it. It's rather like breathing air. We don't have to be constantly looking for air and finding it to breathe. Common sense is the medium in which we move all the time. And we can see exactly what it looks like if you have no common sense by looking at the extraordinarily tragic, conflicted, unhappy, unfulfilled, painful lives of people with schizophrenia is probably the perfect example of what happens when you lose common sense. And by the way, with it, you lose any sense of humor. These two things go together. So as we now find in our culture, certain people won't allow common sense and they won't allow sense of humor, because they know sense of humor will lead us back to a much more balanced and commonsensical position. Sense of humor is actually far from being a way of stoking differences or hatreds, is a way of resolving differences and hatreds in a way that doesn't involve violence or unpleasantness. Anyway, I don't want to go off down that one. Let's just stick with common sense. Einstein is quoted as saying common sense is the bunch of prejudices that we acquire by the age of 18. And I say absolutely correct. And they're the ones that won't help you with quantum mechanics or with space-time and gravity, but will help you in life. And it's exactly that age of 18 when people with schizophrenia find they can no longer contact the world. They talk about this sense of devitalization, of the loss of sense of belonging in the world, and they're saying, I see other people can just do things, but I can't work out what the rules are by which they do it. The answer is they're using their common sense.
Mm.
And it's by no means an impoverished thing. It's a very rich thing that takes into account a whole host of different values without making them explicit.
Yes.
And it marries reason with feeling. And all along we know that reason and feeling not only need to be kept in play together as though they were somehow antagonistic to one another, but that they actually thrive on one another, and that has been pointed out many times over the years, going back to Aristotle, to Enlightenment philosophers like Vauvenargues, and forward to Antonio Damasio's researches, show that emotion is the basis of reason. It is emotion that taught mankind to reason, said Vauvenargues in the 18th century. And, this is obvious in all the great philosophers, that they don't autistically rule out our intuitions, our feelings, our imagination. They know that these things are complementary to one another, and that reason is impoverished when it's separated from intuition and feeling, and intuition and feeling are impoverished when they're separated from reason.
Yes. Now, perhaps we could wrap up with a great surprise I had towards the very end of the chapter, where you quote Sri Aurobindo, who is, as you know,
yes.
an Indian poet and yogi whom I wholeheartedly admire and maybe humbly try to follow his teachings. And because I felt, well, again, once more, Iain puts one more gear into this whole train of thought, and dares to mention the supra-rational, because it's really important to talk about heuristics and these intuitions people have. But there you open the discourse, or at least to entertain these more evolutionary ideas about our mind or rationality not being the end point, but being part of a process by which we don't need to talk about the irrational. We can start talking about the supra-rational, which may sound weird or spooky to many people, but I just felt, let me tell you, that quoting Sri Aurobindo at the very end was an incredible way to end the chapter, because that really points towards more that we can do in that direction.
Very good. Yes. Perhaps I should quote this passage from Sri Aurobindo, because it's worth hearing, partly because it begins with the same idea that we've seen so many times, including, and we'll see more of it in part 3, in Oriental traditions, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and in North American native peoples' mythologies, this idea that there is something inside us that is wise and should be the master, but that there is something else that is of a lesser rank, but is peremptory and thinks it knows everything and takes over. In other words, the story of the master and his emissary. So I'll just read it, if that's okay, Alex.
Wonderful, yes.
If the reason is not the sovereign master of our being, nor even intended to be more than an intermediary or minister, an emissary, in other words, it cannot succeed in giving a perfect law to the other estates of the realm, although it may impose on them a temporary and imperfect order as a passage to higher perfection. The rational or intellectual man is not the last and highest ideal of manhood, nor would a rational society be the last and highest expression of the possibilities of an aggregate human life, unless we give to this word, reason, a wider meaning than it now possesses, and include in it the combined wisdom of all our powers of knowledge, those which stand below and above the understanding and logical mind, as well as this strictly rational part of our nature. The spirit that manifests itself in man and dominates secretly the phases of his development is greater and profounder than his intellect and drives towards a perfection that cannot be shut in by the arbitrary constructions of the human reason. It reminds me of Schopenhauer, who says somewhere, there is something in you wiser than your mind.
Yes. What a proposal to entertain, that mankind is still evolving.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
indeed. And I think forgetting that mankind is evolving is a sort of endemic problem. We imagine that we're at the summit, and that therefore it's good that we take control of everything and sort it out according to the extraordinarily imperfect understanding we have now.
Yes.
And if we survive, humans in the future will look back on this as a consummate age of folly, where what the Greeks called hubris led to our downfall and destruction.
Well, Iain, I feel blessed to have these conversations with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Also, to me, it's very useful to be able to say some of this. I mean, I suppose what I should just say, because it just strikes me so much in dealing with a difficult chapter like this, where what I could say, what I have said in my written work, could be mistaken or misunderstood in a relatively brief attempt to convey it, is that there is so much more examples, more refinements to what I'm saying in the written book than can ever be conveyed in these talks. So,
Definitely. So read the book.
well,
Enjoy the book if you can.
certainly, yeah, certainly read the book before you shoot me. Anyway, but yes, I quite like people to read the book.
Yes. And at the same time, I hope also that through dialogue, some new sparks of insight can manifest between the two of us. I think it sometimes happens, and that's also the magic of doing it like that. So it serves
That,
both as a teaser to the book, but maybe it can bring something more alive,
yes,
and that can only happen through sound.
definitely. And you know, you when you say things, they spark off ideas in my mind in a way which is very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Well, so that's all for this time. Next, going to be chapter 19, and we're going to be talking more about intuition again, right?
Yes,
Intuitive
and
insight.
imagination, which I
Yes.
haven't said much about.
Yes.
So there isn't a hard and fast distinction, but there must be a distinction. I mean, they're not the same things, intuition and imagination. And also, I think we will probably try and deal with the coda to part two, because that is the end of part two of the book.
Wow. Yeah.
So
Looking
there we are.
forward to
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Yes. All right.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alex.
My pleasure.